Mr Chair. It's good that the Greens have got a position of some principle over the government's fiscal position. And the leader of the Greens has set out the fact that there are some choices, and they're quite legitimate choices, and government gets to weigh them up one way or the other. And as explained in question time, the government's decided that it would be better to reduce spending where it's low priority than to put on a levy. It's quite possible that a government could make a different decision. That stands, I have to say, in stark contrast to the Labor Party, whose views on this are still still forming, perhaps, still fluid. Certainly impossible to describe to anyone else who's not part of their own little internal squabbles over economic issues. Well, I don't think they do, because it's a bit like the position on GST, the GST increase, where the government went through a public debate. There was a high degree of understanding in the public about the increase in GST well before it was announced, not the style of some of our former finance ministers here who just announced all the big packages on the day. So people understood that. The Labor Party understood what the government's position was, and in the time since the 2010 budget, they still can't make up their mind whether they're for it or against it. They took the bus out, and after a couple of stops no one would get on it in the tax campaign, so they started taking the axe to each other instead of to the tax. But we hear it coming back again with the worry about it almost lost the Mana by-election. That was meant to be campaigning to get rid of GST. They still almost lost a safe seat. And I don't blame the candidate completely. I think it was the Labor Party rather than the candidate. So they still can't make up their mind. Well, they're for and against it. Well, I think they're sort of for and against the income tax cuts, and I think they're against GST increase. They're just not going to do anything about it. And I suspect it will be the same with the discussion about how the earthquake is financed, where the Labor Party will be unable to make up its mind about whether it supports the reductions in expenditure and the more strongly controlled government expenditure, which will be required to get the New Zealand government's accounts back to surplus. But we are certainly aiming to do that. The earthquake has made the job more challenging. If it hadn't been for the earthquake, with tight government expenditure, we may have been able to get back to surplus perhaps as early as 2013-14. We'll never quite know now. The government set out on that path early in the year to control expenditure more tightly. The earthquake came along. We have to meet the earthquake costs. They aren't choices like a lot of our government programs are choices. The earthquake costs don't amount to choices, and we'll aim to get back to surplus. And of course the fiscal discipline won't end as soon as we get back to surplus, because by that time the New Zealand government will have a higher stock of debt that will sit alongside a very high stock of private sector debt, and both the private sector and the government will face a challenge over the next 10 years or so to try and get its stock of debt down. Why do we worry about that? Well, simply because of the kind of events that we have seen go on in the last 6 months, which none of us would have forecast 6 months ago. A large-scale earthquake in Christchurch, a disaster on an even grander scale in Japan, which may affect us through its impact on the Australian economy, if not directly on our economy, where they're a relatively small trading partner. So we are at the edge of our comfort zone, in fact probably past the edge of our comfort zone, with the amount of debt that government is racking up over the next couple of years. So, Mr Speaker, the government accounts that we've been debating and the budget that we will be debating in this House in a few months are focused on getting the government's books back in order at the same time as rebalancing the economy to where it is going to earn more than it spends through growth in the tradable sector and, relatively speaking, a shrinkage in the non-tradable sector, and I have to say it's going to be a fairly long job.
I call Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for that intervention by the Minister of